Anthony Albanese's personal approval rating has been falling. The ALP's primary and two-party preferred vote has also declined. But why? And can Anthony Albanese turn this around? Now, there are likely many reasons underscoring the decline in support. Different people have likely turned on Anthony Albanese for different reasons. What is important for one person might not be for another. However, we can go through in no particular order some of the major factors, and let me know if you think that I've missed anything. Now, the first major factor is likely cost of living, which likely dominates everything at the moment, given the stubbornly high inflation in Australia and the rather stagnant wage growth, which has increased by much less than inflation has. People are just feeling poorer and poorer over time, which is not a great thing if you want to get re-elected. Anthony Albanese and the ALP have been blamed for the cost of living crisis. Renters, of course, face higher rents, but landlords too face increasing expenses, and expenses have increased vastly more than rents have. This is on the back of things such as interest rates and repair costs, all of which have been skyrocketing. Petrol prices also remain elevated. Groceries have increased in price. Everything costs more money. No one feels better off. This is especially when we're considering wage growth, which is stubbornly below inflation on an after-tax basis. Anthony Albanese and the ALP are weathering the blame. Now, some factors are beyond their control. For example, if there are geopolitical issues, they can't very well go in and stop those from occurring. However, they can help to mitigate and soften the blow from those. Also, some of their decisions appear to exacerbate the problems we're facing. This is over both the short term and the long term. At the moment, we've got a huge infrastructure build-out, which is driving up the cost of materials and labour, which in turn drives up the cost of things like repairs for property, or drives up the cost of hiring a handyman, or drives up the cost of getting an electrician. All of these things add to costs because they increase the demand for many things, ranging from supplies through to labour. Now, much of this expenditure is at the state level, and therefore it isn't technically within the federal government's remit. However, the federal government oftentimes is co-funding many of these, and is green-lighting many of them to go ahead, oftentimes with degrees of financial support. The federal government could try to take steps to push for a pause in that infrastructure funding, push for a pause in the funding going toward it, thereby helping to alleviate some of the inflation pressure, which would feed throughout the economy. And that's just one example. Labour is also pushing toward renewables, which is also going to be inflationary, at least in the build-out phase, and this therefore is going to push up prices for almost everything at the moment. Labour's industrial relation policies also appear set to increase the costs of labour more generally, while also actually harming many of the workers in contractor relationships. The ALP appears to be doing a lot of policies that certainly aren't disinflationary and could in fact be inflationary. Now, to be fair, the ALP and Anthony Albanese have done some things correctly. For example, they have not touched housing policy. This in fact is appropriate and probably is actually good for trying to get inflation under control. It might not seem like it immediately, but actually not doing anything in this space is the best way to alleviate problems, because by not doing anything, they actually encourage more supply than would otherwise be the case. For example, touching negative gearing would significantly worsen the housing crisis. It would do this by both deterring construction, which is already relatively low, but also inducing landlords to more proactively raise rents. When the landlord has negative gearing, they can tax deduct the costs involved in running a property, and therefore they can be a little bit more indifferent toward rent being a little bit below market. But if you remove negative gearing, they're going to need to push up rents in order to get closer toward break even, i.e. to make less of a loss. Negative gearing enables landlords and property owners to subsidize tenants. Without negative gearing, you would have higher costs overall, and less construction and less supply would therefore mean higher rents and higher costs overall. Rent caps, which the Greens seem to be pushing, but the ALP has rejected, would also annihilate new construction. The reason for this is if there are rent caps, then there's no incentive for an investor to go out and build a property. There would be no incentive for a constructor or a builder to go out and build a property development. For example, apartment blocks would simply not get off the ground. Because for a developer to make ends meet on an apartment block, they need to be able to sell to both investors and owner-occupiers. But if the investors desert the market, then the property developer can't sell those properties, and therefore the property development would simply not get off the ground. That is, you simply would have a chronic undersupply of rental properties, which would just make the whole situation significantly worse. I.e., the Labour Party has at least done something good by not touching anything in that space. But But in other areas, the ALP has fallen rather short, and voters are blaming Anthony Albanese and the ALP for the cost of living crisis. The next issue is Anthony Albanese's and the ALP's push toward more socially progressive values. Now, The Voice is but one example of this, and this has to some extent turned off many voters, particularly in ALP-held seats. Now, this might not lose them electorates in the House of Representatives, but it could undermine their vote in the Senate, and this could be a problem for the ALP. The Voice is a paradigmatic example of the problems the ALP faces in this space. First, Anthony Albanese handled the messaging incredibly poorly. Anthony Albanese shredded his trustworthiness by failing to level with Australians about The Voice in detail, by failing to answer questions that Australians had. By relying on platitudes and aphorisms, he appeared to be a little bit duplicitous. He appeared to be deliberately misleading people about The Voice's powers by calling it merely advisory, or by calling it an outstretched hand, or by using various other platitudes to try to describe it. He appeared to be obfuscating over both The Voice and other matters such as treaty, which he was clearly intent on pursuing, but he tried to obfuscate about. People simply didn't really believe Anthony Albanese. They started to believe he was pulling the wool over their eyes. And if he was doing it about The Voice, then what else is he doing it about? So the issue here is partly The Voice, but also partly how he was handling it and the perceptions that were raised about his character and his leadership. Second, The Voice fell into the identity politics trap. In so doing, it somewhat tarred the government and made the government look like it was intent on enabling bias and discrimination. Now, most Australians dislike bias and discrimination. Australians dislike racism. They think all Australians should have an equal go. They think all Australians should be treated fairly. And this therefore means that the discrimination is unacceptable. But it also means that so-called affirmative action, which implicitly is also discrimination, would also likely fail with many voters. And therefore, by pursuing something like The Voice, the government looked like it was out of step with voters on a key social issue. Third, it to some extent made the government appear to be slightly distracted. As people were struggling with the cost of living crisis, the government spent nearly $500 million on a referendum. $500 million that could have been spent on something else. Now, of course, people can walk and chew gum at the same time. But the problem is, the government was neither walking nor chewing gum. Rather, it was stumbling over itself while salivating its gum onto the sidewalk. The government was not doing anything right when it was pursuing The Voice. It was neither handling cost of living, nor was it actually pursuing The Voice in a manner that people regarded as effective. The third overarching issue is that the ALP and Albanese appear to have embedded old-school 1960s socialism into their policy platform, and this doesn't seem to actually benefit anyone. Now, people should not be indentured servants to either the government nor to their employer. However, the ALP seems to want ever more government control, and to seize ever more power from people, and to seize ever more of people's assets. A primary case in point is the government's approach to the disingenuous superannuation tax changes. The ALP sold this as only targeting the top 1% and being a modest change. But as we've seen from the ALP, a so-called modest change is just a euphemism for a change they want to push ahead that is going to particularly target someone. The word modest in this context is completely meaningless. And the problem is, if you look a little bit beneath the surface, there are major issues with the superannuation tax changes. It would impose additional taxes on balances above $3 million. However, that $3 million is not indexed. It could easily be reduced over time now that the precedent is set, and as inflation starts to take hold more and more and more, people's superannuation tax balances will just push up toward that over time. Now, $3 million might sound like a lot of money at the moment, but by the time an 18-year-old retires, just due to sheer inflation, it won't necessarily be a lot of money at all. And as a result, you're going to get more and more people brought into this, especially if they then lower that threshold, as they could do now that we've got the precedent. Furthermore, it imposes a tax on unrealized capital gains. This is extremely abnormal. What it means is that you get taxed on an asset increasing in value, even if you haven't sold it. This stands in contrast to how you're taxed at the moment. At the moment, suppose you hold some shares in Coles for the sake of argument. You're only taxed when you sell those. The reason for that is Coles shares will fluctuate up and down over time. So if you're taxed on an increase at the moment, well, would you get a refund when the shares go down? Or do you get double taxation if they go up now, then back down, then back up? How exactly does that work? That's a big problem for how that policy would apply in superannuation. The ALP would then bring in this tax on unrealized capital gains. Now that they'd set that precedent on unrealized capital gains in that context, it could then be extended into everything else. Basically, the ALP is trying to test the waters in this area before expanding the tax to other things. It's effectively a movement to a broader tax increase. At least that is my interpretation. It also is basically unworkable, because what happens if your coal shares go up in price and then they fall back down when coal does worse? Do you get a refund in that case? It would appear the ALP doesn't want to give you a refund, but it does appear they want to tax you when the shares go up, then not give you a refund when they fall, then tax you again if they go back up again. It looks rather like a blatant tax grab, and a tax grab that could easily be extended to everyone now that the precedent is actually set. Now, people didn't necessarily realize this at the time. However, with many people, it has actually undermined his support, because people can see behind the curtain. People can see exactly how duplicitous their sales tactics are. The industrial relation forms are also an issue here. They're sold as helping workers, and for some workers they might in fact do so. However, they also harm individual contractors, and many individuals do actually prefer to function as contractors. People aren't always forced onto a contract to enable the company to save money. Rather, some people actually prefer to work on contracts. Furthermore, the industrial relations laws empower unions. The problem with unions is unions have become increasingly concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. A small number of people that are pocketing incredibly fat salaries and are all too willing to throw workers under the bus to achieve whatever particular cause they happen to want. We saw that unions were out of step with their own members' values in relation to the voice as but one example. Furthermore, they might throw one particular category of workers under the bus to benefit another category of workers. Unions are not universally beneficial in this space, but the ALP appears to be beholden to them. The ALP's approach is not the politics of ambition and achievement. It's not the politics of aspiration. They are the policies of tearing people down, but not raising people up. The ALP and Anthony Albanese want to take the Australian economy back to the bad old days of the 1960s and effectively force us into indentured servitude to the state. They don't believe in individual ambition or individual achievement or individual aspiration. They seem to believe that individuals simply exist to serve the state. These factors have all coalesced to undermine ALP support. Which factor dominates with which voter is going to vary. Some people were concerned about the voice, some less so. Some were concerned about other factors such as their fiscal policies, other people less so. Some people were particularly concerned about cost of living, others less so. Which factor dominates will be different for different people, but the ALP now finds itself with a saddlebag full of bad policies. Given that Anthony Albanese is largely wedded to the ALP's official policy platform, he also has limited room to maneuver on many things. Now, the Liberal Party has its own problems, and is going to have a very difficult time actually winning government, especially given the presence of the Teals. And so the Liberal Party's problems are perhaps the ALP's biggest hope. They're possibly hoping that they can Stephen Bradbury their way into an election victory. They're possibly hoping the Liberal Party falls over itself and they almost win by default, which ultimately could happen. The Liberal Party really needs to get its act together if it actually wants to win. But the ALP is certainly not doing a good job addressing concerns. But if you think that I've missed anything, do let me know that in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the ALP's election prospects and what's happening with its declining support.